The Admiral's laughter echoed across the naval training facility as he looked down at the young woman before him. "Little lady," he said with a dismissive smile, "why don't you leave the real tactical training to those who've actually seen combat?" Irene Hill stood there, silent, her jaw tight as the room full of officers chuckled along. What the Admiral didn't know was that every single operator he considered his best had learned their most lethal skills from this same little lady he was now humiliating. And in 72 hours, he was about to find out exactly how wrong he'd been. This is the story of how one woman's quiet competence shattered an admiral's ego and changed an entire military institution forever. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. The morning sun filtered through the high windows of the Special Operations Training Center in Lyon, France, casting long shadows across the worn mats of Training Hall 7. Irene Hill arrived at 0500, 2 hours before the first scheduled session, just as she had every morning for the past 4 years. At 28, she'd become a fixture in this building, though most people walking past wouldn't have given her a second glance. She stood barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and a frame that most would describe as slight. Her appearance was deliberately unremarkable. She wore standard training fatigues without rank insignia, and she moved through the facility with the quiet efficiency of someone who preferred to remain unnoticed. But those who knew, really knew, understood that Irene Hill was arguably the most dangerous person in the entire complex. The training hall smelled of rubber mats, sweat, and the faint metallic tang that came from years of intensive combat practice. Irene walked to the equipment storage area and began her routine inspection. Every knife needed to be sharp but not dangerously so for training purposes. Every practice weapon needed to be balanced correctly. Every safety mat needed to be positioned precisely. Details mattered. In her world, the difference between life and death often came down to millimeters and milliseconds. She'd been a competitive martial artist since age 12, growing up in Lyon with a father who taught defensive tactics to French police forces. By 16, she'd earned her black belt in 3 different disciplines. By 20, she'd competed internationally and won championships that most military operators had never heard of. But competitions weren't combat, and Irene had always known the difference. Her path to this training center had been unconventional. After completing her mandatory military service, she'd been recruited by a small, specialized unit that didn't officially exist on any organizational chart. They'd seen something in her, not just her technical skills, but her ability to read people, to understand how bodies moved under stress, to teach complex techniques in ways that made them instinctive rather than intellectual. For 3 years, she'd worked in the shadows, training operators who were then deployed to places that never made the news. She taught them how to survive when everything went wrong, how to fight when they were outnumbered, how to think clearly when their bodies were screaming at them to panic. Her students had a survival rate that was statistically anomalous. People in certain circles noticed. That's when Commander Laurent Beaumont had found her. Beaumont ran the Advanced Tactical Training Program for France's Special Operations Forces, and he'd been looking for someone who could teach what couldn't be learned from manuals or standard military doctrine. He'd watched Irene work for exactly 45 minutes before offering her a position. "You don't teach techniques," he'd told her after that observation session. "You teach people how to survive. There's a difference." For 4 years, Irene had trained some of the most elite operators in the French military. Her methods were unorthodox. She focused less on strength and more on leverage, less on aggression and more on efficiency, less on domination and more on adaptation. Her students learned to fight smarter, not harder, to use an opponent's force against them, to find advantages in situations that looked hopeless. But her work remained largely invisible. The operators she trained rarely knew her real name. They called her the instructor or simply Hill. They showed up for her sessions, learned techniques that saved their lives in the field, and then moved on to their deployments. Irene preferred it that way. Recognition had never been her goal. Competence was its own reward. The sound of boots on concrete interrupted her preparation. Commander Beaumont entered the training hall, his expression troubled. At 52, Beaumont was a career military officer who'd earned his position through decades of field experience. He was one of the few people in the facility who fully understood Irene's value. "We have a situation," Beaumont said without preamble. "Admiral Durrell is coming for an inspection." Irene continued arranging the training equipment, though her hands paused for just a moment. "When?" "Tomorrow. He's conducting a full review of all training programs. Wants to meet every instructor, observe sessions, evaluate effectiveness." Beaumont's tone made it clear this wasn't good news. Admiral Richard Durrell was a legend in French naval operations, a man who'd commanded missions in 3 different theaters and earned decorations that filled an entire wall of his office. He was also known for his traditional views on military structure, his insistence on conventional training methods, and his vocal skepticism about anything that deviated from established doctrine. At 61, he represented the old guard, an officer who believed that real combat experience trumped any theoretical innovation. "He knows about your program?" Irene asked. "He knows we have unconventional training methods. He doesn't know the specifics." Beaumont paused, choosing his words carefully. "Irene, Durrell is old school. He has certain views about who should be training elite operators." Irene understood immediately. She'd encountered this attitude before, though usually not from someone with the Admiral's level of authority. "You want me to make myself scarce during the inspection?" "I want you to be prepared for his reaction," Beaumont corrected. "Your results speak for themselves. The operators you've trained have the highest mission success rates and the lowest casualty rates in any comparable program worldwide. Those are facts that even Durrell can't dismiss." "But he's going to try," Irene said quietly. Beaumont's silence was answer enough. The rest of the day proceeded normally. Irene ran 3 training sessions, working with operators at different skill levels. The morning session focused on close-quarters combat and confined spaces. The afternoon session covered weapon retention and disarmament techniques. The evening session was her advanced class, where she taught operators who'd already completed multiple deployments and thought they'd seen everything. During the advanced session, she worked with a team that had just returned from a classified operation in West Africa. They were good, well-trained, experienced, confident. Irene spent the first hour systematically dismantling that confidence, showing them gaps in their technique that could have gotten them killed, teaching them counters to moves they thought were unbeatable. "You're thinking like athletes," she told them, her voice calm but firm. "Athletes compete under rules. You don't have rules. Your opponent will do anything to survive, and so must you. Stop fighting fair. Start fighting smart." By the end of the session, the operators were exhausted but energized. They'd learned techniques they'd never seen before, approaches that contradicted their conventional training but made perfect sense once explained. As they filed out, one of them paused at the door. "Instructor," he said, "thank you. That counter you showed us for knife retention? I needed that exact technique 3 weeks ago in Lagos. Wish I'd known it then." Irene nodded. "You know it now. That's what matters." After the operators left, she remained in the empty training hall, running through her own practice routines. This was her meditation, the way she processed the day and prepared her mind. She moved through forms that combined multiple martial arts disciplines, her movements precise and economical. No wasted motion. No unnecessary flourishes. Just pure, efficient technique. She was halfway through an advanced sequence when she sensed someone watching from the doorway. She completed the form before turning to find Commander Beaumont standing there, his expression thoughtful. "How do you do that?" he asked. "Practice," Irene replied simply. "No, I mean how do you make it look so easy? I've seen operators twice your size struggle with those techniques." "Size is a disadvantage if you rely on it," Irene said, collecting her water bottle. "It makes you lazy, makes you think strength can compensate for poor technique. I've never had that option, so I learned to be better." Beaumont walked into the hall, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. "Durrell's inspection tomorrow, be yourself. Don't try to impress him, don't try to prove anything. Just do what you always do. And if he decides my methods are too unconventional, then we'll have a problem, Beaumont admitted. But we'll face it together. Your program has saved lives, Irene. Real lives, in real operations. That's not something even an admiral can dismiss lightly. After Beaumont left, Irene sat alone in the training hall, surrounded by the equipment and mats that had become more familiar to her than her own apartment. Tomorrow would bring challenges. She'd faced skepticism before, faced dismissal and condescension and the assumption that someone like her couldn't possibly understand real combat. But she'd also faced opponents who'd underestimated her, and she'd learned long ago that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest advantage you could have. People who thought you were weak, harmless, insignificant, they made mistakes. They revealed their vulnerabilities. And in combat, whether physical or political, vulnerabilities were everything. Irene Hill switched off the lights and locked the training hall, already planning for tomorrow's sessions. Admiral Durrell was coming to evaluate her program, and she would let him see exactly what he expected to see, a small, quiet woman teaching techniques he probably wouldn't understand. What happened after that would depend entirely on whether the Admiral was smart enough to look beyond his expectations and see what was actually in front of him. Irene suspected he wasn't, but she'd been wrong before. Tomorrow would tell. Admiral Richard Durrell arrived at the Special Operations Training Center at precisely 0800, stepping out of a staff car that gleamed despite the early morning dust that coated everything else on the base. He was an imposing figure, standing well over 6 feet tall with the kind of presence that came from decades of command. His uniform was immaculate, his posture military perfect, and his expression carried the confidence of a man who'd never seriously questioned his own judgment. Commander Beaumont met him at the entrance, accompanied by the facility's senior staff. Irene watched from a distance as the Admiral inspected the formation of officers, noting the way he carried himself, the slight tilt of his chin that suggested he was looking down at people even when they were the same height. She'd seen that posture before in men who believed their rank meant they were smarter than everyone around them. The inspection tour began with the facility's main training areas, the obstacle courses, the weapons ranges, the tactical simulation rooms. Durrell nodded approvingly at these conventional elements, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated his extensive knowledge of standard military training protocols. He was clearly in his element here, surrounded by the familiar markers of traditional military excellence. Irene continued with her scheduled sessions, working with a morning group on defensive tactics. She was aware that the Admiral's inspection tour would eventually reach her training hall, but she refused to alter her routine. The operators in her current session deserved her full attention, and changing her methods to impress a visiting admiral would contradict everything she'd taught them about authenticity under pressure. Your opponent will try to intimidate you, she told the group as they practiced counter-grappling techniques. They'll use size, aggression, reputation, anything to make you doubt yourself. Your job is to see past the intimidation to the actual threat. Fear the technique, not the person. One of the operators, a man named Petit who'd been with her program for 6 months, raised his hand. But what if the intimidation is part of their technique? Some fighters use psychological pressure as effectively as physical force. Then you acknowledge it and adapt, Irene replied. Intimidation only works if you're trying to match their energy. Don't match it. Redirect it. Use their aggression as momentum against them. She demonstrated with Petit, allowing him to attempt an aggressive takedown that relied on forward momentum and superior weight. At the last moment, she pivoted, used his own force to throw him off balance, and completed a counter that left him controlled on the mat without her having used any significant strength. You see, she said, helping him up. He had every physical advantage, momentum, weight, aggression. I had none of those things. But I had timing, position, and understanding of leverage. In a real situation, that would have ended the threat. The operators practiced the technique in pairs while Irene circulated, making small corrections to positioning and timing. This was her favorite part of teaching, seeing the moment when a concept clicked, when intellectual understanding became physical instinct. She was correcting a student's footwork when she became aware of the inspection group entering the training hall. She didn't stop her instruction or acknowledge their presence. The operator she was working with needed to understand why his stance was leaving him vulnerable to counters, and that took priority over military protocol. "Your weight is too far forward," she explained, gently adjusting his position. "You're committing before you've confirmed the opening. See? Now you're balanced. You can commit to the attack or abort depending on what your opponent does. Options are survival." Behind her, she heard Admiral Durrell's voice, loud enough to carry across the training hall. "Who is that?" Commander Beaumont's response was quieter, but Irene could hear the tension in it. "That's Instructor Hill, sir. She runs our Advanced Tactical Combat program." "Her?" The Admiral's tone carried undisguised skepticism. "She looks like she should be teaching aerobics, not combat tactics." Irene felt her jaw tighten, but she continued her instruction without breaking stride. The operator she was working with had also heard the comment, his expression shifting to anger on her behalf. She shook her head slightly, a small gesture that told him to ignore it and focus on the training. The inspection group moved closer, and Irene could feel the Admiral's attention on her like a physical weight. She completed her circuit of the training pairs, offering corrections and encouragement, then called the group back to the center of the mat. "Good work today," she told them. "Remember, technique beats strength every time, but only if you practice until it's instinctive. Drills tonight at 1900 if anyone wants additional work." As the operators began filing out, Admiral Durrell approached her directly. Up close, he was even more imposing, using his height and presence in exactly the way she'd been teaching her students to recognize and counter. It would have been amusing if it wasn't so professionally threatening. "Instructor Hill," he said, his tone carrying the condescension of someone addressing a child. "I'm Admiral Durrell. I'm here conducting an evaluation of training effectiveness." "Admiral," Irene replied with a polite nod, keeping her expression neutral and professional. "I understand you're teaching combat tactics to our operators," Durrell continued, looking around the training hall with barely concealed doubt. "How long have you been in this position?" "For years, sir." "And your combat experience?" "Where did you serve?" Here it was, the question that always came from men like Durrell. The assumption that real knowledge only came from conventional military service, from deployments and campaigns and the kind of experiences that earned medals and official recognition. "I completed my mandatory service with the 13th Parachute Dragoon Regiment," Irene replied. "After that, I worked with specialized training units in various capacities." "Various capacities," Durrell repeated, his tone making it clear he found this answer insufficient. "So you're teaching our elite operators based on, what, exactly? Some martial arts background?" Commander Beaumont stepped in, his voice firm. "Admiral, Instructor Hill's program has produced exceptional results. The operators trained under her methodology have demonstrated significantly improved performance metrics across all combat scenarios." "Performance metrics," Durrell said dismissively. "Commander, I've been in actual combat situations. I've commanded operations where real lives were on the line." With all due respect to Miss Hill here, he gestured toward Irene in a way that made the title sound patronizing. "Teaching some techniques in a controlled training environment is not the same as preparing operators for the chaos of real combat." Irene felt something cold settle in her chest, the familiar sensation that came when she recognized a situation sliding beyond her control. She could defend herself, could point out that her students' survival rates spoke for themselves, that her methods were based on decades of practical application. But she also understood that men like Admiral Durrell rarely changed their minds based on logic or evidence. They believed what they wanted to believe, and right now he wanted to believe that she was out of her depth. "Admiral," she said carefully, "I understand your concerns. Perhaps you'd like to observe a full session? See the training methodology in practice?" Durrell glanced at his watch, then at Commander Beaumont with an expression that suggested he had more important things to do than humor a young woman pretending to be a tactical instructor. "I think I've seen enough," he said. "Commander, we should discuss restructuring this program. I have some recommendations about bringing in instructors with actual combat credentials. Sir, Beaumont began, but Durrell was already walking toward the exit, his entourage following like a wake behind a battleship. At the doorway, the Admiral paused and looked back at Irene. "Little lady," he said with what he probably thought was a kindly smile, "maybe you should consider teaching self-defense classes for civilian personnel. I'm sure you're very good at that sort of thing. But the advanced tactical training for our operators? That requires experience you simply don't have." Then he was gone, leaving Irene standing alone in the training hall with Commander Beaumont and a handful of junior staff members who looked uncomfortable with what they'd just witnessed. The silence stretched for a long moment. Finally, Beaumont spoke, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Irene, I'm sorry. That was completely inappropriate." "It's fine," Irene said, though her hands were clenched at her sides. "I've heard worse." "It's not fine. Your program is one of the most effective training initiatives we've ever implemented. The Admiral has no right to dismiss it based on his personal prejudices." "He has every right," Irene corrected quietly. "He's an Admiral. He can recommend whatever changes he wants, and they'll probably be implemented." She walked to the equipment storage area and began organizing the training gear, needing something to do with her hands. Behind her, she could hear Beaumont discussing the situation with his staff, their voices low and concerned. They were good people, they believed in her work, but that wouldn't matter if Durrell decided her program was a waste of resources. The real irony, the part that made her want to laugh or scream or both, was that Admiral Durrell's best operators, the ones he constantly referenced as examples of proper training, had almost all come through her program. The team that had executed that flawless hostage rescue in Marseille 6 months ago? 3 of the 4 operators had trained with her for over a year. The sniper who'd made that impossible shot during the embassy situation in Dakar? She'd taught him how to control his breathing under extreme stress, how to make his body invisible to itself so that nothing existed except the target. But none of those operators would mention her in their official reports. That wasn't how her program worked. She taught them, improved them, sent them back to their units where they were credited with developing their own skills through dedication and hard work. The invisibility had been deliberate, designed to let the operators take credit for their own growth. Now that same invisibility meant Admiral Durrell had no idea that the results he celebrated were directly connected to the little lady he'd just dismissed. The afternoon dragged by in a haze of routine tasks that felt suddenly meaningless. Irene taught her scheduled sessions, but her mind kept returning to the morning's encounter, replaying the Admiral's condescending smile, his assumption that her appearance meant she couldn't possibly be competent, his dismissal of 4 years of proven results because they didn't fit his expectations. CTA at approximately 1,500 words, we've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. That evening, Irene sat alone in her small office adjacent to the training hall, reviewing reports from recent operations. This was the part of her job that no one saw, the detailed analysis of how her training translated to real-world outcomes. She tracked everything, which techniques were most effective in different scenarios, which operators struggled with specific skill sets, what patterns emerged in successful versus failed missions. The data was unambiguous. Operators who completed her full training program had a mission success rate 14% higher than those who didn't. They had 32% fewer injuries during combat operations. They demonstrated significantly better decision-making under stress. The numbers didn't lie, but she also knew that numbers didn't matter if the people reading them had already decided what they wanted to believe. A knock on her office door interrupted her analysis. She looked up to find 3 operators standing in the hallway, members of her advanced evening class. The one in front was Lieutenant Garnier, a career Special Forces soldier who'd completed multiple tours in hostile territories. "Instructor," Garnier said, his expression serious. "We heard what happened this morning with the Admiral." Irene closed her laptop, sighing. "News travels fast. We wanted you to know that's bullshit," one of the other operators said bluntly. Sorry for the language, ma'am, but it is. We've all trained with multiple instructors, worked with the best tactical teachers in the French military. You're better than all of them. I appreciate that, Irene replied, but appreciation doesn't change command decisions. Maybe it should, Garnier said. He stepped into the office, the other two following. Instructor, that counterknife technique you taught us last month? I used it in Mali 2 weeks ago. Disarmed a hostile who had position, surprise, and momentum. Without your training, I'd be dead. That's not an exaggeration. I would literally be dead. The other operators nodded, sharing similar stories. Techniques that had saved their lives, taught them how to survive situations where conventional training would have failed them, given them advantages they hadn't known were possible. The Admiral called you little lady, Garnier continued, his voice hardening. He has no idea that you've trained most of the operators he considers his elite forces. He thinks his best people succeeded because of traditional training and his command excellence. He doesn't know that they succeeded because someone he just dismissed taught them how to actually survive. Irene felt something shift inside her, not anger exactly, but a cold clarity that came from recognizing an inflection point. She'd spent 4 years working in the shadows, accepting invisibility as the price of doing meaningful work. But perhaps that invisibility had become its own kind of problem. Perhaps it was time for Admiral Durrell and people like him to understand exactly what they were dismissing when they looked at her and saw only a little lady teaching aerobics. Thank you, she told the operators. I mean that sincerely. But right now, the best thing you can do for this program is continue being excellent in the field. Results will speak louder than anything else. After they left, Irene sat in the darkness of her office, thinking about Admiral Durrell's inspection, his condescension, his absolute certainty that someone like her couldn't possibly be training elite operators. She thought about the operators he considered his best, the ones whose success he attributed to his own command excellence and traditional training methods. And she smiled, a small, cold smile that anyone who'd sparred with her would have recognized as dangerous. Admiral Durrell was about to learn a lesson that her students already knew: never assume that someone is weak just because they don't look threatening. Never dismiss competence because it doesn't match your expectations. And never, ever underestimate the person who's been training in silence while you've been taking credit for their results. She opened her laptop and began composing a message to Commander Beaumont. It was time to stop being invisible. It was time for the Admiral to meet his best operators and learn exactly who had trained them. Commander Beaumont read Irene's proposal twice before looking up at her across his desk. The morning sun cast sharp angles through his office window, illuminating the concern etched into his weathered face. You want to organize a demonstration, he said slowly, where operators trained under your program face off against operators trained through conventional methods. Not a competition, Irene corrected, settling into the chair across from him. A tactical evaluation. Real-world scenarios that test decision-making under pressure, adaptive problem-solving, survivability skills. The kind of situations where my training methodology should show measurable advantages. Should show advantages? Beaumont raised an eyebrow. That's more cautious language than I expected from you. I'm confident in my methods, Irene replied. But I'm also realistic. The Admiral has made his assessment based on appearance and assumptions. Data won't change his mind. He needs to see the results in a context he respects. Beaumont leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against the armrest. You understand this could backfire spectacularly. If your operators don't perform as expected, it gives Durrell exactly the ammunition he needs to shut down your program entirely. And if they do perform as expected? Then we have a different problem, Beaumont said with a slight smile. We prove that an Admiral's assessment was fundamentally flawed. That's not the kind of thing flag officers appreciate, regardless of the evidence. Irene had considered this angle carefully. Military hierarchy wasn't designed to reward people who made their superiors look foolish, even when those superiors were objectively wrong. But she'd also spent 4 years watching her students succeed in the field while she remained invisible, credited with nothing. That invisibility had protected her program, but it had also made the program vulnerable to dismissal by anyone who couldn't see past surface assumptions. Commander, the Admiral is already recommending restructuring. My program is at risk regardless of what we do. At least this way, we control the narrative. Beaumont studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You've thought this through. I've had plenty of practice thinking through scenarios where I'm underestimated. Fair point. Beaumont pulled out his tablet and began making notes. We'd need to structure this carefully. Make it seem like a routine training evaluation rather than a challenge to the Admiral's judgment. Perhaps frame it as a demonstration of different training methodologies for his educational benefit? Exactly, Irene said, feeling the first stirrings of hope. We present it as an opportunity for the Admiral to observe various approaches to tactical training. Let him draw his own conclusions from what he sees. Except we both know what he's going to see, Beaumont said. Your operators systematically outperforming conventionally trained personnel in every meaningful metric. Only if my methods actually work as well as I believe they do, Irene replied, though her confidence was genuine. She'd seen these techniques save lives in real operations. A controlled demonstration should only make the advantages more obvious. Beaumont spent several minutes working through logistics on his tablet, occasionally asking Irene questions about specific scenarios and evaluation criteria. Finally, he looked up with an expression that mixed approval and concern. I can arrange this for 3 days from now. That gives us enough time to coordinate with other training units and set up proper evaluation protocols. But Irene, he paused, his tone becoming serious, you need to understand what you're risking. If this goes wrong, it won't just end your program. It could end your career. The Admiral has enough influence to make sure you never work in military training again. Irene met his gaze steadily. And if I do nothing, the program ends anyway. At least this way, I go down fighting. That's what I thought you'd say, Beaumont replied, returning his attention to the tablet. Let's make sure you don't go down at all. Over the next 3 days, Irene prepared with the same meticulous attention to detail she applied to everything. She selected scenarios that would highlight the specific advantages of her training methodology, situations requiring adaptive thinking rather than brute force, problems where conventional approaches would fail but creative solutions would succeed, challenges that tested survivability rather than pure combat dominance. She also selected her operators carefully. Not necessarily her best students, but the ones who best exemplified her teaching philosophy. Operators who'd internalized the lessons about leverage over strength, adaptation over aggression, intelligence over intimidation. Lieutenant Garnier would lead the demonstration team. He'd been with her program longest and understood not just the techniques but the underlying principles. The others she chose represented different specialties: close quarters combat, tactical shooting, hostage rescue, combat medicine. Each had stories of how her training had saved their lives in real operations, though those stories would remain unspoken during the demonstration. The evening before the evaluation, Irene gathered her selected team in the training hall. They stood in a loose semicircle, their expressions serious as they understood what tomorrow represented. You all know why we're doing this, she began, her voice calm despite the tension she felt. Tomorrow isn't about proving I'm right. It's about demonstrating that the methods you've learned have real value. That they work not because I taught them, but because they're fundamentally sound tactical principles. With respect, instructor, Garnier said, tomorrow is absolutely about proving you're right. The Admiral dismissed you based on ignorance. We're going to educate him. The other operators murmured agreement, but Irene shook her head. Tomorrow is about you, she corrected firmly. About showing what you've learned, what you can do, what you've become through training and dedication. I'll be watching from the sidelines where people like the Admiral think I belong. You'll be in the scenarios, executing under pressure, demonstrating competence that speaks for itself. She paused, looking at each of them in turn. Don't fight for me tomorrow. Fight the way I taught you, smart, efficient, adaptable. That's all I ask. After they left, Irene remained alone in the empty training hall, surrounded by mats and equipment that had become her second home. Tomorrow would determine whether 4 years of work had any lasting value or whether Admiral Durrell's dismissive little lady comment would be her epitaph in military training. She'd spent her entire career being underestimated, and she'd learned to use that underestimation as a weapon. Tomorrow, Admiral Durrell would discover what happened when assumptions met reality. The tactical evaluation facility occupied a separate section of the base, a sprawling complex of training rooms designed to simulate everything from urban combat to hostage scenarios. Admiral Durrell arrived promptly at 0900, accompanied by a group of senior officers that had grown since his initial inspection. Word had spread about the demonstration, and now half the base command staff wanted to witness what was being described as a comparative assessment of training methodologies. Irene stood in the observation room, deliberately positioning herself near the back where she could watch without drawing attention. She wore her standard training fatigues, no rank insignia, nothing to suggest she was anything more than a junior instructor present to observe. Several officers glanced at her briefly before dismissing her as insignificant, exactly as she'd intended. Commander Beaumont handled the briefing, explaining the evaluation structure with professional precision. We've prepared 4 scenarios that test different aspects of tactical competence. Each scenario will be attempted by 2 teams, one trained through our conventional program, one trained through our specialized methodology. Independent evaluators will score performance based on objective criteria, mission completion, efficiency, adaptability, and survivability. Admiral Durrell listened with arms crossed, his expression suggesting he considered this a waste of time but was too professional to say so directly. "In the specialized methodology you're referring to," he said, "this is the program run by that young woman from yesterday? The aerobics instructor?" Irene felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her expression neutral. Several officers in the room shifted uncomfortably at the Admiral's dismissive tone, though none challenged him directly. "Instructor Hill's program, yes sir," Beaumont replied evenly. "The operators you'll observe today have completed her advanced training curriculum." "Well, let's see what 4 years of unconventional training produces," Durrell said, his tone making clear he expected to be unimpressed. "Though I'm skeptical that anything we see today will justify diverting resources from proven methods." The first scenario was a hostage rescue situation in a simulated office building. The conventional team entered with textbook precision, their movements coordinated and professional. They cleared rooms methodically, engaged hostile targets with appropriate force, and successfully extracted the hostage in 14 minutes with 0 casualties. "Excellent execution," Admiral Durrell commented, nodding approvingly. "That's what proper training produces. Clean, efficient, professional." Then Lieutenant Garnier's team entered the same scenario. Irene watched intently, noting the subtle differences in their approach. They moved differently than the conventional team, less rigid in their formations, more responsive to environmental cues. When they encountered a locked door that the first team had breached with explosive charges, Garnier's team bypassed it entirely, finding an alternate route that saved precious seconds. The hostage rescue played out with a fluidity that looked almost choreographed, but Irene recognized it as pure adaptability. Her operators weren't following a predetermined plan, they were reading the situation in real time and adjusting their approach based on what they encountered. When a hostile appeared in an unexpected position, they didn't engage with overwhelming force like the conventional team had. Instead, they used positioning and timing to neutralize the threat with minimal resources. Final time, 9 minutes, 40 seconds. 0 casualties. Hostage extracted with less ammunition expended and less structural damage to the facility. The observation room fell silent as the numbers appeared on the display screen. Admiral Durrell frowned, studying the metrics with obvious skepticism. "They got lucky," he said finally. "Found a faster route by chance." "The scenario randomizes room layouts for each iteration," Commander Beaumont replied carefully. Both teams faced equivalent challenges. The second team simply found more efficient solutions. The second scenario tested combat medicine under fire. A wounded operator needed treatment while hostile forces maintained pressure on the position. The conventional team executed a solid tactical withdrawal, establishing a defensive perimeter while their medic worked. It was competent, professional, and by the book. Casualty stabilized in 8 minutes under moderate hostile fire. Garnier's team approached the same situation completely differently. Instead of withdrawing to a defensive position, they used suppressive fire and movement to create temporary windows of safety, allowing their medic to work in shorter, more efficient bursts. They turned what should have been a static defensive situation into a dynamic problem that they solved through constant adaptation. Casualty stabilized in 4 minutes, 20 seconds. Hostile forces neutralized with half the ammunition expenditure. Admiral Durrell's frown deepened. That was reckless. They exposed themselves to unnecessary risk. With respect, Admiral, one of the evaluators interjected, the risk assessment shows they actually maintained better cover throughout the engagement. Their movement patterns made them harder targets than the static defensive position. The third scenario was close-quarters combat in confined spaces, Irene's specialty. She watched her operators move through the tight corridors and cramped rooms like water flowing around obstacles, never committing to positions that couldn't be instantly abandoned, never using force when positioning would suffice. They turned the environment itself into a weapon, using walls and doorways and furniture to create advantages that negated their opponent's size and strength advantages. The conventional team fought well but conventionally, relying on training that emphasized dominance and control. Garnier's team fought like they'd been taught to think rather than just react. The difference was stark. By the time they reached the fourth scenario, a complex tactical problem that required teams to adapt to changing objectives mid-mission, the pattern was undeniable. The operators trained under Irene's program weren't just performing well, they were demonstrating a fundamentally different approach to tactical thinking. They were faster, more efficient, more adaptable, and more survivable than their conventionally trained counterparts. Admiral Durrell stood silent in the observation room, his jaw tight as he watched the final scenario scores appear on the display. Every metric favored the specialized training program. Every objective measure showed that Irene's methods produced superior results. The observation room had grown quiet, officers exchanging glances that mixed surprise with something approaching vindication. They'd all heard the Admiral's dismissive comments yesterday. Now they were watching proof that his assessment had been completely wrong. Finally, Durrell spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "Commander Beaumont, I'd like to speak with the team leaders from both groups." Immediately. The debriefing room felt smaller with Admiral Durrell's presence filling it. The team leaders from both groups stood at attention, the conventional team showing professional composure while Garnier and his operators maintained expressions of careful neutrality. Commander Beaumont stood near the door, his posture tense as he anticipated what might come next. Irene remained in the back corner of the room, still maintaining her invisible observer status. The Admiral hadn't acknowledged her presence, his attention fixed entirely on the operators who'd just completed the scenarios. "Lieutenant Garnier," Durrell began, his tone formal and controlled, "your team demonstrated exceptional performance across all scenarios. Your tactical decision-making was innovative and your execution was flawless. Where did you receive your advanced training?" Garnier's expression didn't change, but Irene could see the slight tension in his shoulders. "Multiple sources over my career, sir. Various specialized courses and field experience. But your most recent tactical training?" Durrell pressed. "The techniques you demonstrated today, where did those come from?" There was a pause, a moment of silence that stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. Garnier's eyes flicked briefly toward the corner where Irene stood, then returned to the Admiral. "Instructor Hill's program, sir. The specialized methodology that was being evaluated today." Admiral Durrell's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to identify individually: surprise, confusion, and something that might have been embarrassment. "The young woman from yesterday. The one teaching in Training Hall 7. "Yes, sir," Garnier replied. "Instructor Hill has been training special operations personnel for 4 years. Most of the operators you've commended for exceptional performance in recent missions have completed her program." The Admiral turned slowly, his gaze sweeping the room until it found Irene in her corner. For the first time since entering, He seemed to actually see her, not as background personnel but as someone whose presence mattered. "Is this true, Commander Beaumont?" Durrell asked, though his eyes remained fixed on Irene. "Yes, sir," Beaumont confirmed. "Instructor Hill's program has trained approximately 70% of our active special operations personnel over the past 4 years. The mission success rates and survivability metrics we've been reporting, they're largely attributable to her training methodology." Durrell's jaw tightened visibly. "And yesterday, when I suggested restructuring her program, no one thought to mention this. With respect, Admiral, you didn't ask for performance data. You made your assessment based on other criteria." The words hung in the air like an accusation, though Beaumont's tone remained professionally neutral. Irene watched the Admiral process this information, saw the moment when he realized that his dismissive little lady comment had been made about the person responsible for training his best operators. "Instructor Hill," Durrell said, his voice carrying a formality that hadn't been present in their previous interaction, "perhaps you could explain your training methodology. Help me understand how you produce these results." Irene stepped forward, maintaining her composure despite the surreal nature of being asked to explain something the Admiral had dismissed as irrelevant just 24 hours earlier. "My methods focus on adaptive problem-solving rather than predetermined responses," she began, her voice steady and professional. "I teach operators to read situations dynamically, to find advantages in unconventional approaches, to prioritize efficiency over dominance. Size, strength, traditional advantages, these become less important when you understand leverage, timing, and environmental awareness." "And you developed this methodology through what experience, exactly?" There was still skepticism in Durrell's tone, though it was muted now by the evidence he'd just witnessed. "Through 20 years of martial arts training, 3 years working with classified units, and 4 years of iterative refinement based on field results," Irene replied. "Every technique I teach has been tested in real operations. When something doesn't work, I modify or eliminate it. What remains is what actually saves lives." Durrell walked closer, studying her with an intensity that would have been intimidating if Irene hadn't spent years teaching people how to not be intimidated. "You're telling me that the operators I've been commending for their exceptional combat performance, the ones I attributed to superior conventional training and command excellence, were actually trained by someone I dismissed as an aerobics instructor?" The room went very quiet. Several officers found sudden interest in their boots. Commander Beaumont's expression remained carefully neutral, though Irene detected the ghost of a smile at the corners of his mouth. "I don't teach aerobics, sir," Irene said quietly. "I teach survival." Lieutenant Garnier cleared his throat, drawing the Admiral's attention. "Sir, if I may speak freely?" Durrell nodded, his expression suggesting he wasn't sure he wanted to hear what came next but recognized he needed to. "Instructor Hill saved my life," Garnier said bluntly. "Not metaphorically. Literally. The knife defense technique she taught me was used in Mali during a hostile engagement. Without that specific training, I would have been killed. That's not opinion. That's fact. The same is true for most of us," another operator added. "We've all had situations where her training made the difference between completing the mission and becoming casualties. The techniques look unconventional because they are unconventional. But they work." Admiral Durrell stood in the center of the room, surrounded by evidence that contradicted everything he'd assumed about training, capability, and competence. Irene could see him struggling with it, trying to reconcile what he'd believed with what he was being forced to acknowledge. "Why didn't you defend yourself yesterday?" he asked Irene suddenly. "When I dismissed your program, you could have cited your results, showed me the data. Why did you let me continue thinking you were out of your depth?" Irene considered the question carefully before answering. "Because men like you don't change their minds based on data, Admiral. You change your minds based on evidence you can see, situations you can witness, proof that contradicts your assumptions in ways you can't dismiss. Yesterday, I was just a small woman teaching techniques you didn't understand. Today, I'm the person who trained the operators you respect. The only thing that changed was your willingness to look past your initial assessment. The truth of it landed like a physical blow." Durrell's expression showed he understood exactly what she was saying, that his prejudice had nearly destroyed a program responsible for the combat effectiveness he'd been taking credit for. "Commander Beaumont," the Admiral said after a long silence, "I need to review the complete performance data from Instructor Hill's program. Mission outcomes, casualty rates, operator evaluations, everything." "Yes, sir," Beaumont replied. "I'll have the reports on your desk within the hour." Durrell nodded, then turned back to Irene. "Instructor Hill, I owe you an apology. My assessment yesterday was inappropriate and uninformed. Your program is clearly producing exceptional results, and my comments about reassigning you to civilian self-defense classes were—" He paused, searching for the right word, "regrettable." "Thank you, sir," Irene replied, though she noted he'd stopped short of actually apologizing for calling her little lady or suggesting she belonged teaching aerobics. However, Durrell continued, and Irene felt her guard rise at the word, "I have concerns about the broader implementation of your methodology. What works in a specialized program with hand-selected operators may not scale to general training populations." And there it was. Unable to dismiss her competence directly, the Admiral was now questioning whether her success was replicable. It was a more sophisticated form of skepticism, but skepticism nonetheless. Commander Beaumont's office had become a war room of sorts over the following week. Spreadsheets covered his desk, showing performance metrics from Irene's program compared against conventional training outcomes. The data was comprehensive and undeniable. Operators trained under her methodology showed consistent advantages across virtually every measurable criterion. Irene sat across from Beaumont, reviewing the latest analysis with a growing sense of frustration. The Admiral has had this data for 6 days. He's seen the field reports, the mission outcomes, the operator testimonials. What more does he need? He needs to feel like expanding your program was his idea, Beaumont replied with weary pragmatism. Flag officers don't like being proven wrong publicly. They like discovering previously overlooked opportunities that they can then champion as their own initiatives. "So we wait for him to take credit for my work?" "We wait for him to support expanding your work, regardless of who gets credit," Beaumont corrected. "That's how change happens in military institutions. You pick your battles." Irene understood the logic, but understanding didn't make it less infuriating. She'd spent 4 years building a program that saved lives, had her competence publicly questioned by someone who hadn't bothered to examine the evidence, and now was being told to wait patiently while that same person decided whether her methods deserved broader implementation. "How long do we wait?" she asked. "Not much longer," Beaumont said, glancing at his computer screen. "The Admiral has scheduled a senior staff meeting for tomorrow. He specifically requested your presence, which suggests he's ready to make some kind of announcement." The meeting took place in the base conference room, a formal space dominated by a large table and walls covered with commendations and unit insignia. Admiral Durrell sat at the head of the table, flanked by senior officers including Commander Beaumont. Irene occupied a seat halfway down the table, positioned between officers who outranked her by considerable margins. Durrell opened the meeting with a comprehensive review of recent special operations outcomes, highlighting several successful missions and commending the units involved. Irene recognized most of the operations mentioned. She'd trained at least half the operators involved in each one, though the Admiral made no mention of this connection. "These successes demonstrate the caliber of our personnel," Durrell continued, "but they also highlight opportunities for improvement. Our mission success rates, while good, could be exceptional. Our casualty rates, while acceptable, could be reduced further." He paused, letting this assessment settle before continuing. "To that end, I've been reviewing our training protocols extensively over the past week. I've identified a specialized program that shows significant promise for broader implementation." Irene felt Beaumont's subtle glance in her direction but kept her own expression neutral and professional. "Instructor Hill has been running an advanced tactical training program that emphasizes adaptive problem-solving and efficiency over conventional force-dominant approaches," Durrell said, his tone carrying none of the dismissiveness that had characterized his initial assessment. "The performance metrics from this program are exceptional. Operators trained under this methodology show 14% higher mission success rates and 32% lower casualty rates compared to conventional training. Several officers around the table exchanged surprised glances. Clearly, most hadn't been aware of these statistics, despite Irene's program operating on the same base for 4 years. "I'm recommending that we expand Instructor Hill's program significantly," Durrell announced. "I want her methodology integrated into our core training curriculum for all special operations personnel. Not as a replacement for conventional training, but as an essential complement to it." The room erupted in questions, officers asking about logistics, resource requirements, implementation timelines. Durrell fielded them with practiced authority, laying out a vision for how Irene's methods could be scaled across the entire special operations training system. Irene sat quietly, listening to the Admiral describe her program with the enthusiasm of someone who'd just discovered it, despite having dismissed it as irrelevant days earlier. He made no mention of his initial skepticism, no acknowledgement that he'd suggested reassigning her to teach civilian self-defense. Instead, he positioned himself as a forward-thinking commander who'd identified an innovative training approach and was championing its expansion. "Instructor Hill," Durrell said, turning his attention to her directly, "this expansion will require significant additional resources and personnel. You'll need to train other instructors in your methodology, develop standardized curriculum materials, and oversee implementation across multiple training facilities. Are you prepared to take on that responsibility?" It was a test, Irene realized. The Admiral was offering her exactly what she'd wanted: broader impact, more resources, validation of her methods, but he was framing it as a challenging assignment that she might not be capable of handling. Even now, even after everything, there was still subtle skepticism in how he presented the opportunity. "Yes, sir," Irene replied firmly. "I'm prepared to expand the program as needed. I've already been developing training materials for other instructors, anticipating the possibility of broader implementation." Several officers looked surprised at this. Durrell's expression suggested he hadn't expected her to be quite so prepared. "You've been developing instructor training materials?" he asked. "For how long?" 3 years, sir," Irene replied. "I recognized early that if my methodology proved effective, it would need to be scalable. I couldn't personally train every operator in the French military, so I began documenting my approaches in formats that other instructors could learn and implement." Without being asked to do so, Durrell observed. "Initiative is part of my job, sir," Irene said evenly. "I prepare for opportunities before they arise. That's how I was trained." There was a moment of silence as this landed, a subtle reminder that Irene's competence wasn't accidental or lucky. She'd been preparing for this moment for years, working in obscurity while building something that could withstand scrutiny when the time came. Commander Beaumont cleared his throat. "Sir, if I may, Instructor Hill's preparation goes beyond just training materials. She's maintained detailed performance analytics for every operator who's completed her program. She's tracked how specific techniques perform in different operational contexts. She's refined her methodology based on continuous feedback from real-world applications. The program you're proposing to expand isn't experimental, it's already proven and documented. Then implementation should be straightforward," Durrell said, though his tone suggested he was recalculating his assessment of Irene yet again. "Instructor Hill, I want you to put together a detailed expansion proposal. Timeline, resource requirements, instructor training protocols, everything we'll need to roll this out across our special operations training system. How quickly can you have that ready?" "It's already done, sir," Irene replied. "I can have the proposal on your desk this afternoon." The Admiral blinked, clearly not expecting this response. "You have a complete expansion proposal already prepared?" "Yes, sir. I updated it last month when I received new field data from operator deployments. It includes cost analysis, implementation timelines, instructor training requirements, and projected outcomes based on current performance metrics." Durrell leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that mixed respect with something that might have been chagrin. "You've been planning for this expansion for quite some time." I've been ready for it, sir, Irene corrected. Whether it happened or not wasn't within my control. Being prepared for it was. The meeting concluded with Durrell assigning various officers to support the program expansion, setting timelines for implementation, and establishing oversight committees. Irene took notes efficiently, already mentally organizing the work ahead. This was what she'd wanted, the opportunity to have real impact beyond just the operators she could personally train. As officers filed out of the conference room, Admiral Durrell gestured for Irene to remain. When the room had cleared except for Commander Beaumont, the Admiral spoke with uncharacteristic directness. "Instructor Hill, I need you to understand something," he began. "My initial assessment of you was wrong. Completely wrong. I looked at you and saw someone who didn't fit my expectations of what a tactical instructor should be. I dismissed your competence based on appearance and assumptions. That was a failure of leadership on my part. It was closer to an actual apology than Irene had expected. Thank you, sir. I appreciate you saying that. I don't say it to make myself feel better," Durrell continued. "I say it because that kind of prejudice has no place in military leadership, and I should have known better. You've built something exceptional here, something that's saving lives and improving mission outcomes. I nearly destroyed it because I couldn't see past my own biases." Irene nodded, acknowledging the admission without making it easier for him. Some lessons needed to be uncomfortable to be truly learned. "Going forward," Durrell said, "I want to ensure your program has the support and resources it needs to succeed. Not because I'm trying to take credit for your work, though I'm sure it will look that way to some people, but because operators' lives depend on the quality of their training. You've proven that your methods save lives. That's all that should matter." "That's all that has ever mattered to me, sir," Irene replied. As she left the conference room, proposal documents already organized in her mind, Irene reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd been dismissed as a little lady teaching aerobics, had her competence questioned by someone who hadn't bothered to examine the evidence, and had been forced to prove herself through demonstration when her results should have spoken for themselves. This wasn't a standard training scenario. Rousseau hesitated for a moment, then adjusted his attack angle to account for her lower position. Irene's response looked nothing like the first defense. Her body mechanics were completely different, the leverage points changed, the disarm technique unrecognizable. But the result was identical. She controlled the weapon hand, disrupted his structure, and completed the disarm. "Different technique, same principle," she explained, returning to her feet. "If I'd tried to use the first defense from a kneeling position, it wouldn't have worked. The angles are wrong, the leverage is wrong, everything about the technical execution is wrong. But the principle, control the weapon, disrupt the structure, that principle works from any position." She could see the shift in the room's energy. Skepticism was giving way to curiosity, defensiveness softening into engagement. "Now multiply that adaptability across every combat scenario," Irene continued. "Urban environments, confined spaces, multiple opponents, weapons of opportunity, environmental hazards. If your operators have memorized techniques, they need a different technique for every variation. If they understand principles, they have one approach that adapts to infinite variations." The instructor training session continued for 6 hours, moving from theoretical discussion to practical application. Irene demonstrated principles across different combat contexts, showing how the same underlying concepts could be applied to striking, grappling, weapons, and environmental tactics. More importantly, she showed the instructors how to teach those principles in ways that became instinctive rather than intellectual. By the end of the day, even Rousseau was taking notes with genuine interest. During the break, he approached Irene with an expression that mixed respect and chagrin. "I need to apologize," he said quietly. "I came into this session thinking you were too young and too inexperienced to teach me anything useful. That was prejudice, plain and simple." "You're not the first person to think that," Irene replied without rancor. "Probably won't be the last. But here's what bothers me," Rousseau continued. "I've been training soldiers for 20 years. I'm good at what I do, and I know I'm good. But watching you teach today, I realized I've been teaching them to survive. You're teaching them to be unkillable. There's a difference, and I should have figured that out years ago. You figured it out today, Irene said. That's what matters. Now you can teach it to your paratroopers, and they'll be better for it. The instructor training program continued for 3 weeks, with Irene working extended hours to ensure every instructor fully understood not just her techniques but her teaching philosophy. She knew that the program's long-term success depended on these instructors being able to replicate her methods across different units and contexts. Admiral Durrell visited twice during the training period, observing sessions with an attention to detail that suggested he was still trying to fully understand what made Irene's approach so effective. During his second visit, he pulled her aside after a particularly intensive training session. I've been reviewing field reports from operators who completed your program before the expansion, he said, holding a tablet filled with operational data. The pattern is remarkable. Your students don't just succeed in missions, they succeed in missions that should have failed. They survive situations where others would have become casualties. How do you teach that? I don't teach them to avoid failure, sir, Irene replied. I teach them that failure isn't final. When a technique doesn't work, when a plan falls apart, when everything goes wrong, they have principles to fall back on. They can adapt, improvise, and find solutions that weren't in any manual. That's not about being tougher or stronger. It's about being more flexible in how you think. Durrell nodded slowly, still processing. When I first met you, I thought you were out of place in a tactical training facility. Now I'm wondering if everyone else has been out of place and you're the only one who understood what training should actually accomplish. It was as close to full acknowledgement of his initial mistake as Irene expected to receive. She appreciated it nonetheless. 6 months after the program expansion began, Irene received an unexpected summons to Paris. The Ministry of Defense wanted a briefing on her training methodology, specifically how it could be adapted for other branches beyond special operations. Commander Beaumont accompanied her on the trip, serving as both military escort and moral support. You're nervous, Beaumont observed as their train approached Paris. I can tell because you're reorganizing your briefing materials for the 3rd time. I'm not nervous, Irene replied, then reconsidered. I'm cautious. Ministry officials aren't operators. They think in terms of budgets, politics, and institutional structures. Explaining why my methods work in those terms is different than demonstrating them practically. You'll do fine, Beaumont assured her. Just remember, you're not asking for permission anymore. You're explaining results they've already approved. The program expansion is happening with or without their full understanding. This briefing is educational, not evaluative. Marchand studied the data intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions about methodology and measurement criteria. Finally, she looked up at Irene with an expression that was hard to read. Instructor Hill, do you understand what you're proposing? If we implement your methodology across the entire military, it means retraining thousands of instructors, modifying decades of established curriculum, and fundamentally changing how we think about tactical education. That's not a small undertaking. I understand, ma'am, Irene replied. But with respect, the alternative is continuing to train soldiers using methods that are demonstrably less effective than what we now know is possible. That seems like the larger problem. There was a long silence. The ministry officials exchanged glances, some form of silent communication passing between them. Admiral Durrell maintained a carefully neutral expression, though Irene thought she detected approval in his eyes. We need to discuss this internally, Marchand said finally. Admiral, Commander Beaumont, Instructor Hill, thank you for the briefing. We'll have decisions regarding broader implementation within the month. As they left the ministry building, Irene felt the tension that had been coiled in her shoulders finally begin to release. Beaumont walked beside her, his expression thoughtful. That went better than I expected, he said. Marchand's actually considering full military implementation. 6 months ago, that would have been unthinkable. 6 months ago, I was teaching in obscurity, Irene replied. Now I'm briefing ministry officials about restructuring military training. It doesn't feel real. It's real, Admiral Durrell said, having followed them out of the building. And for what it's worth, Instructor Hill, you handled that briefing expertly. Du Bois was testing you, trying to find weaknesses in your argument. You didn't give him any. He raised valid concerns, sir, Irene said. Scalability is a legitimate question. Which you answered with data instead of defensiveness, Durrell replied. That's what convinced them you're serious about this being larger than just your personal program. They parted ways at the train station, Durrell returning to Toulon while Irene and Beaumont headed back to their base. During the journey, Irene stared out the window at the French countryside rolling past, thinking about how drastically her life had changed in half a year. She'd gone from being an invisible instructor that most people on the base didn't know existed, to briefing ministry officials about military-wide training reform. She'd been dismissed as a little lady teaching aerobics, and now senior officials were seriously considering implementing her methods across the entire French military. What are you thinking about? Beaumont asked. I'm thinking about all the operators who didn't have this training, Irene said quietly. The ones who died because they only knew conventional responses. The ones who failed missions because they couldn't adapt when plans fell apart. If this expansion happens, if we can actually change how the military trains its personnel, how many lives does that save? How many missions succeed that would have failed? Impossible to calculate, Beaumont replied. But definitely more than zero. Irene nodded, returning her attention to the window. The responsibility felt enormous, heavier than anything she'd carried before. But it was also exactly what she'd been working toward since she first started teaching, making sure that soldiers had every possible advantage, every possible tool, every possible chance of coming home alive. If that meant restructuring how an entire military approached training, then that's what she'd do. The ministry's decision came 3 weeks later, delivered via official correspondence that arrived at Commander Beaumont's office on a Tuesday morning. He called Irene in immediately, his expression revealing nothing as he handed her the document. Irene read it twice, making sure she understood correctly. The Ministry of Defense was authorizing a 2-year pilot program implementing her methodology across multiple branches of the French military. They were allocating significant budget for instructor training, curriculum development, and performance evaluation. And they were assigning her as the program's director, with authority to oversee implementation across all participating units. This is bigger than I expected, Irene said, still processing the implications. This is bigger than anyone expected, Beaumont replied. You're no longer just an instructor, Irene. You're now responsible for potentially changing how France trains its entire military. That's the kind of career-defining opportunity that most people never encounter. Or the kind of career-ending disaster if it fails, Irene added quietly. The difference wasn't dramatic in any single scenario, but across multiple exercises, the pattern became undeniable. Fontaine's data showed that the units trained with Irene's methods completed missions an average of 18% faster with 23% fewer simulated casualties. After the final exercise, Colonel Fontaine requested a private meeting with Irene in his office. She entered uncertain whether she was about to receive commendation or criticism. Her methods often inspired both in equal measure. Instructor Hill, Fontaine began, gesturing for her to sit. I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand I'm not saying this lightly. I was wrong about your methodology. Completely, fundamentally wrong. Irene waited, letting him continue. I thought you were another theorist with impressive credentials but no understanding of practical infantry operations, Fontaine said. I was prepared to prove that your methods wouldn't work with regular soldiers. Instead, you've proven that I've been training infantry inefficiently for 3 decades. Sir, conventional training isn't inefficient, Irene said. It's just incomplete. Your soldiers were already good. My methods just gave them additional tools for specific situations. Don't minimize what you've accomplished, Fontaine replied firmly. My soldiers are measurably more effective now than they were 3 months ago. That's not about giving them additional tools. That's about teaching them to think differently about tactical problems. And that difference will save lives. He stood, walking to his office window that overlooked the training grounds where soldiers were running through exercises. I'm recommending full implementation of your program across my entire command. More than that, I'm recommending to Division Command that they mandate it for all infantry units. This needs to be standard, not optional. Thank you, sir, Irene said, feeling a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying begin to lift. Fontaine's endorsement would carry significant influence with other skeptical commanders. Don't thank me, Fontaine replied. Thank you. You took a colonel who thought he knew everything about training soldiers and showed him he'd been missing fundamental concepts. That takes courage, especially when that colonel could have ended your pilot program with a negative evaluation. As Irene left Fontaine's office, she received a message from Commander Beaumont. Ministry wants progress update. They're hearing positive reports from pilot units. This might happen faster than anyone expected. Irene stood on the base's training grounds, watching soldiers practice techniques she'd developed, taught by instructors she'd trained, implementing principles she'd spent years refining. 6 months ago, she'd been briefing ministry officials who were cautiously considering a pilot program. Now that pilot program was succeeding beyond initial projections, and the possibility of military-wide implementation was becoming real. Admiral Durrell had called her a little lady and suggested she teach aerobics. Colonel Fontaine had expected her methodology to fail with regular infantry. Countless others had looked at her and seen someone too young, too small, too inexperienced to revolutionize military training. But none of them had seen what she'd seen, that the most dangerous opponents weren't the ones who looked threatening, but the ones who understood how to think clearly when everyone else was operating on instinct and assumption. She'd taught that lesson to hundreds of operators and now to thousands of regular soldiers. And if the ministry approved full implementation, she'd teach it to an entire military. The little lady was changing how France thought about training its soldiers. And she was just getting started. 1 year after the pilot program's launch, the Ministry of Defense convened a comprehensive review of results. The meeting took place in the same conference room where Irene had first briefed skeptical officials, but this time the atmosphere was markedly different. Instead of having to prove her methods worked, she was presenting data about how well they were working across diverse military contexts. Deputy Minister Marchand opened the meeting with an acknowledgement that surprised everyone present. Before we review the data, I want to address something directly. A year ago, several people in this room, myself included, had significant doubts about whether Instructor Hill's methodology could scale beyond special operations. Those doubts were understandable given the magnitude of what was being proposed. They were also completely wrong. That evening, Irene returned to her hotel room and opened her laptop to check messages. Among them was a video call request from Captain Garnier, now Major Garnier and Deputy Commander of France's Special Operations Training Establishment. I watched your keynote online, he said when she accepted the call. It was perfect. You told the truth without being bitter about what you went through. I'm not bitter, Irene replied honestly. Frustrated sometimes, yes. But not bitter. Everything I experienced taught me something useful, even the dismissals and the skepticism. Especially those things, actually. The Admiral would be proud, Garnier said. Before he died last month, he told me that meeting you was the most important learning experience of his final decade in service. He said you taught him that certainty was the enemy of wisdom. Irene felt a pang of sadness at the news of Durrell's death. Despite their difficult beginning, he'd become a genuine supporter and, in his way, a friend. I didn't know he'd passed. I should have reached out more often. He understood you were busy changing how militaries train their personnel, Garnier replied with a slight smile. He followed your work closely, you know. He kept a file of reports from every country implementing your methodology. Called it as evidence that old admirals can learn new things collection. They talked for another hour, discussing program developments, new adaptations being tested, and challenges emerging as the methodology spread to militaries with radically different operational contexts. Finally, Garnier asked the question that Irene had been expecting. Are you happy? With how everything turned out, with where you are now, are you happy? Irene considered the question carefully. I'm satisfied. I set out to develop training that would save lives and improve mission effectiveness. That's happened on a scale I never imagined. But happiness? That's more complicated. Because you're still being underestimated, Garnier said, understanding immediately. Even with everything you've accomplished, people still see your age and gender before they see your competence. Some people, Irene corrected. Not everyone. And honestly, I've gotten better at using that underestimation strategically. When someone dismisses me initially, I learn a lot about how they think, what their blind spots are, where their assumptions will make them vulnerable. That's useful information. That's a very tactical way of looking at prejudice, Garnier observed. I'm a tactical person, Irene replied with a slight smile. I look at every situation and ask, what advantages can I find here? Being underestimated is an advantage if you're patient and prepared. It's only a disadvantage if you let it make you doubt yourself. After ending the call, Irene stood at her hotel window looking out over Geneva's night skyline. Somewhere in this city, military leaders from dozens of nations were discussing training innovations, sharing methodologies, and hopefully reconsidering their assumptions about what capability looked like. And somewhere in 19 different countries, operators and soldiers were using techniques she'd developed, applying principles she'd refined, surviving situations that might have killed them without her training. They'd never know her name, would never realize that the methodology that saved their lives came from someone an admiral once dismissed as a little lady teaching aerobics. That anonymity no longer bothered her. In fact, it felt appropriate. The best training didn't call attention to itself, it just made people more capable, more adaptable, more survivable. That's what she'd set out to do a decade ago in a small training hall in Toulon, and that's what she was still doing now on an international stage. The little lady had taught an admiral, and through him, militaries across NATO and beyond. She'd proven that competence had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with preparation, principles, and the patience to wait for opportunities while others were making assumptions. Most importantly, she'd shown that the most dangerous opponents, whether in combat or in institutional politics, were often the ones who looked least threatening. The ones who prepared in silence, who built capability without fanfare, who were ready to prove themselves when the moment arrived. Admiral Durrell had learned that lesson the hard way. Now, thousands of military personnel were learning it through training that emphasized adaptation, efficiency, and thinking beyond conventional assumptions. Irene Hill closed her laptop and prepared for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and probably new people who would underestimate her based on appearance before learning to respect her based on results. She was looking forward to it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.